At exactly noon, the sun went out, not behind a cloud, not in a partial eclipse. The sun, in the middle of the day, at Passover, when the moon was on the opposite side of the earth and no eclipse was astronomically possible, went dark. For 3 hours, over Jerusalem. That is not a metaphor, that is not poetry. Multiple ancient writers recorded it. The Roman historian Thallus wrote about it within decades of the event, calling it an unusual darkness. Julius Africanus, writing in the 3rd century, quoted Thallus directly. Phlegon of Tralles, a Greek historian who served during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, noted a great eclipse of the sun in his chronicles, an eclipse that was greater than any previously known. He even recorded the year. It matched. Something happened to the sky on that day. And if you're only hearing that now, if no one ever told you that pagan historians documented the darkness over Jerusalem, then you haven't heard the full story. This documentary is the full story, not just the theological story you already know. The forensic story, the atmospheric story, the political story, the story of a city of 2 million people jammed with Passover pilgrims from across the Roman Empire, experiencing something so disturbing that witnesses spent the rest of their lives trying to explain it. We're going to rebuild that day from the ground up, hour by hour, stone by stone. We're going to walk through Jerusalem on that morning, stand in the Praetorium while Pontius Pilate makes the worst decision of his career, climb the hill called Golgotha, and watch the sky fall apart at noon. By the time this is over, you won't just know what happened. You'll understand why that day still feels, 2,000 years later, like the kind of thing that shouldn't have been possible. Let's start at dawn. The city of Jerusalem in 30 AD. Most scholars place the crucifixion between 30 and 33 AD, and we'll return to the evidence on that, was not the quiet holy city of Sunday school paintings. It was a pressure cooker. Under normal circumstances, Jerusalem held somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 permanent residents. But at Passover, that number exploded. The historian Josephus, writing about a Passover census conducted under the high priest Cestius in 66 AD, counted the lambs slaughtered for the feast and calculated, based on the required ratio of 10 people per lamb, that approximately 2.7 million people were present in the city. That number is probably inflated, but even conservative estimates put Passover Jerusalem at 500,000 pilgrims or more on top of the permanent population. 500,000 people flooding into a city that covered roughly 450 acres. Think about that. London's financial district, the square mile, is roughly 260 acres. Jerusalem at Passover was denser than that, with no plumbing, no electricity, animals everywhere, markets operating from before sunrise, the smell of thousands of sacrificial lambs filling the air, and the tension, always the tension, of a conquered people performing their most sacred religious festival under the watchful eye of an occupying military force. The Romans had learned to be nervous at Passover. The holiday celebrated liberation from Egyptian slavery. It was, at its core, a festival of freedom from oppression. And every year, the Roman prefect, the governor, would travel from his comfortable headquarters in Caesarea Maritima on the Mediterranean coast to Jerusalem, not out of religious devotion, out of military necessity, because Passover was when revolutions started. The air in the city would have been unlike anything most of us have experienced. Thousands of animals, lambs, pigeons, cattle, penned in temporary enclosures throughout the city and in the outer courts of the temple. The smell of the Kidron Valley, which served as the city's primary drainage channel, mixed with the smoke from the temple's perpetual altar fire. Vendors selling everything a pilgrim could need: ritual vessels, sacrificial animals, food, lodging, currency exchange. The Passover lambs had to be purchased with temple currency. Roman coins bearing the image of Caesar were considered idolatrous for this purpose. which meant the money changers' booths were operating at full volume, the sound of coins and argument filling the outer courts from first light. The language you heard in that city on any given Passover week would have been astonishing. Aramaic, the common street language of Judea and Galilee. Hebrew, used in religious contexts, in prayer, in Torah reading, the language of the sacred. Greek, the lingua franca of the entire Eastern Mediterranean, the language most literate people in the Roman Empire shared. Latin, the language of the occupiers, heard from soldiers and in official contexts, and dozens of regional dialects and languages from the diaspora communities, Jews from Egypt, from Babylon, from Persia, from Asia Minor, from Rome itself. All of them converged on Jerusalem 3 times a year. Passover was the biggest of these convergences. This was the world's most diverse city for 1 week every spring, and it was sitting on a powder keg. Pontius Pilate arrived in Jerusalem for the festival, as he did every year, with a reinforced military escort. He took residence in the Praetorium, most likely the Herodian Palace on the western hill of the city, a massive fortress palace complex built by Herod the Great, capable of housing thousands. Pilate didn't like Jerusalem. He didn't like the Jews. The historical record on this is unambiguous. Josephus and Philo both document multiple incidents in which Pilate deliberately provoked the Jewish population, introducing Roman military standards bearing images into the city, raiding the temple treasury to fund an aqueduct project, massacring Galilean pilgrims. He was, by any measure, a brutal administrator with a contempt for the people he governed, but he was also politically exposed. In the early 30s AD, Pilate's patron in Rome, Sejanus, the powerful prefect of the Praetorian Guard, who had been his primary protector, had been arrested and executed for treason against Emperor Tiberius. Pilate was suddenly without cover. Any additional complaint filed against him in Rome could end his career, could end more than his career. He needed this Passover to go quietly. It wasn't going to. Sometime in the early morning hours before dawn, in the garden called Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives, just outside the city's eastern wall, a man named Jesus of Nazareth had been arrested. The arrest itself was unusual. It was carried out by a detachment of Roman soldiers, a cohort or part of one, working in conjunction with the temple guard under the authority of the high priest Caiaphas. The Greek word used in John 18:3 is spira, a Roman military unit. This wasn't a simple temple police action. This had Roman military involvement from the start. John 18:3, anchor that verse. By the time the city was waking up, the merchants opening their stalls, the pilgrims performing their morning prayers, the priests beginning the Passover preparations in the temple complex, Jesus was already in custody. He had already been through what John's Gospel describes as an interrogation before Annas, the former high priest who still held enormous power behind his son-in-law Caiaphas. He had already been through a hearing before the Sanhedrin. He had been struck, mocked, and handed over, and now he was at the Praetorium. Matthew 27:2 says it plainly. They bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate the governor. It was morning. The city didn't know yet. Let's be precise about the geography here, because it matters to understanding what happened next. Jerusalem in the 1st century was built on 2 main ridges, separated by a central valley, the Tyropoion Valley. The upper city, on the western hill, was where the wealthy lived, the high priestly families, the Herodian aristocracy, the Roman administrative complex. The lower city on the eastern hill and the southern slope was where the common people lived, where the markets were, where pilgrims camped. The Temple Mount, the great platform built by Herod the Great, roughly 35 acres of stone platform, one of the largest human constructions of the ancient world, dominated the northeastern corner. The Praetorium, where Pilate was conducting his interrogation, was in the upper city on the western side. Golgotha, the execution site, was outside the city walls to the northwest. The distance between the two was roughly 600 meters, about a third of a mile. That third of a mile would take hours to cross. Pilate interrogated Jesus. The Gospels record fragments of this conversation, and they are deeply strange. Pilate asks if he is the king of the Jews. Jesus responds with a question. Is that your own idea, or did others talk to you about me? John 18:34. Pilate, irritated, comes back. Am I a Jew? Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done? John 18:35. This is not the interrogation of a man who knows what he's dealing with. This is the interrogation of a man who is confused, uncomfortable, and looking for an exit. John's account says that after hearing Jesus describe his kingdom as not of this world, Pilate went back out to the crowd that had gathered and made an announcement. I find no basis for a charge against him. John 18:38. He tried to release him. This is a historical detail that often gets glossed over. Pilate didn't want to execute Jesus, not because he was a good man, the historical record makes clear he wasn't, but because he couldn't find a prosecutable Roman charge. The charges the Sanhedrin brought were religious charges, blasphemy, claiming to be the Son of God. These were Jewish religious offenses. They weren't Roman crimes. Pilate needed a Roman crime to justify an execution. The crowd outside gave him one. Luke 23:2 records the specific accusation the chief priests pressed. We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king. Tax resistance, royal pretension. Now you have Roman crimes. And Pilate, already politically weakened, already nervous about complaints reaching Tiberius, heard the additional threat in John 19:12. If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar, not a friend of Caesar. With Sejanus gone, that phrase was not an abstraction, it was a death threat. Pilate washed his hands. Matthew 27:24. A gesture borrowed from Jewish ritual purity law, a strange choice for a Roman, which may be Matthew's way of emphasizing the irony. The Roman is performing a Jewish purification ritual while handing a Jewish man to an unjust death. And then he gave the order. The scourging came first. We need to spend time here because most people have no idea what Roman scourging actually was. It was not a simple flogging. Roman law recognized 3 levels of beating: fustigatio, flagellatio, and verberatio. The scourging applied to those condemned to crucifixion was verberatio, the most severe. It used a flagrum, a whip with multiple leather thongs, each tipped with pieces of bone, lead balls, or shards of metal. The victim was stripped, tied to a post and beaten until the centurion in charge decided to stop. There was no legal limit on the number of strokes. Jewish law capped flogging at 39 strokes to stay safely under the biblically mandated 40. But this was Jewish law. Roman law had no such provision. The medical literature on crucifixion, and there is a significant body of it, including a landmark 1986 article in the Journal of the American Medical Association by Dr. William Edwards, describes the physical effects of severe Roman scourging in clinical detail. The skin of the back would be torn to ribbons, subcutaneous tissue exposed, significant blood loss. In some cases, victims died from scourging alone before they ever reached the cross. Jesus survived, but he was severely compromised. There was something else that happened between the scourging and the walk to Golgotha. Matthew 27:31 records it. The soldiers took Jesus into the Praetorium and gathered the entire cohort around him. They dressed him in a scarlet robe. They wove a crown of thorns and pressed it onto his head. They put a staff in his right hand. They knelt before him, mocking, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck him on the head with the staff. They spit on him. A cohort was typically 600 men. This wasn't a few soldiers being cruel. This was a prolonged, organized, ritualized humiliation by hundreds of soldiers who had enormous contempt for the Jewish population they were occupying. Scholars have noted the dark ritual quality of this scene. It echoes the Sakeah, a Babylonian festival in which a condemned man was briefly crowned and treated as a king before his execution. Some have argued the soldiers were replaying a known mock coronation ritual. Others argue it was improvised cruelty. What matters for our purposes is this. By the time they led Jesus out of the praetorium, he had been awake since the previous evening, had been through multiple interrogations, had been scourged, and had been physically abused by hundreds of soldiers. He was in catastrophic physical condition, and they were about to make him carry the crossbeam to his own execution. The Via Dolorosa, the route Jesus walked from the praetorium to Golgotha, is a matter of ongoing archaeological and historical debate. The traditional route, marked today in Jerusalem's Old City, may or may not match the first-century topography, but some elements are agreed upon. It was a public route. It passed through populated areas. People saw him. The crossbeam, the horizontal patibulum, weighed between 75 and 125 pounds, based on archaeological evidence for the dimensions of first-century wooden beams. The vertical stake, the stipes, was typically left permanently at the execution site, driven into the ground or set in a socket in the rock. Jesus collapsed under the weight of the patibulum. Mark 15:21 records the Romans pressing a bystander into service. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. The mention of Simon's sons, Alexander and Rufus, by name is remarkable. Mark's gospel is generally dated to Rome. Paul, in Romans 16:13, greets a Rufus chosen in the Lord and his mother, who has been a mother to me too. Same family? Most scholars think so, meaning that this moment of compelled service, a stranger forced to carry a cross, may have catalyzed a family's entire faith trajectory. The sons of the man who carried Jesus' crossbeam may have become known leaders in the early Christian community in Rome, but that's a detail for another day. They reached Golgotha. The name in Aramaic means the place of the skull. The Latin translation is Calvaria, Calvary. The location was outside the city walls, which was required by Jewish law for executions. It was near a road. Crucifixion was always performed in visible, trafficked locations. The whole point of crucifixion, from a Roman imperial standpoint, was terror by spectacle. The site was likely a small rocky outcropping, possibly resembling a skull in profile, hence the name. Archaeological investigation of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built on the traditional site, has confirmed that the area was indeed outside the city walls in the 1st century and contained ancient quarrying and tombs consistent with the gospel descriptions. They offered him wine mixed with myrrh. Mark 15:23. A mild analgesic, customary. He refused it. Then they crucified him. This moment, which every gospel records with the same stark brevity, deserves that same brevity. They nailed him to the wood. Archaeologists discovered in 1968, in a tomb in northeast Jerusalem, the skeletal remains of a crucifixion victim, a man named Yehohanan ben Hakol, dating to the 1st century. His heel bone had an iron nail still embedded in it, 11.5 centimeters long. The nail had bent on impact with a knot in the wood and couldn't be removed. His forearm showed evidence consistent with nail wounds. For the first time in history, we had physical, skeletal confirmation of what Roman crucifixion actually looked like in 1st century Judea. The nails went through the wrists, specifically through the space between the wrist bones, the carpal bones, known as the space of destot, not through the palms, which cannot support body weight. Medieval art got this wrong. The Greek word "care," translated as hand in the Gospels, included the wrist and forearm in ancient usage. The physics of crucifixion were deliberately calibrated for maximum suffering over maximum time. The position forced the victim into a progressive cycle of suffocation. Hanging with arms extended, it became impossible to exhale fully without pushing up on the feet to relieve the pressure on the chest. But pushing up on the feet meant putting weight on the nail through the foot, causing agonizing pain. The victim would cycle between partial suffocation and agonized upward push over and over for hours, sometimes for days. It was one of the most grotesque inventions in human history. Above Jesus' head, Pilate had a titulus, a placard, nailed. John 19:19-20 records the inscription, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." It was written in 3 languages, Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests protested to Pilate, change it to, "He claimed to be King of the Jews." Pilate, apparently done negotiating for the day, refused. "What I have written, John 19:22. It was the 3rd hour, approximately 9 a.m. Pause here, because we need to establish the city around Golgotha at this moment. This was Passover. The temple was operating at full capacity. The morning Tamid sacrifice, the daily burnt offering, had been performed at dawn. The priests were now in the process of the massive logistical operation of receiving the Passover lambs, which would be brought by the thousands of pilgrim families throughout the day and slaughtered in the temple precincts. The sound and smell of sacrifice filled the eastern side of the city. The courts of the temple were packed, and on a hill to the northwest, 3 men hung dying. 2 others were crucified with Jesus, described in Matthew and Mark simply as lestai, a Greek word usually translated robbers or bandits, but which first-century readers would have recognized as the same term Josephus used for Jewish revolutionary insurgents, political rebels against Rome. These were not ordinary criminals. They were likely political prisoners, part of the same social upheaval that had brought Jesus to Pilate's attention. Luke 23:39-43 records a remarkable exchange between these 3 dying men. One of the insurgents mocks Jesus, echoing the crowd below, "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." The other rebukes him, "Don't you fear God since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then, to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus responds, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." A theological conversation on a cross while dying. There were people at the foot of the cross. John 19:25-27 names them: Jesus' mother Mary, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene, and one disciple identified as the disciple whom Jesus loved, traditionally identified as John himself. John records that Jesus, looking down at his mother and this disciple, said, "Woman, here is your son," and to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that moment, John says, the disciple took Mary into his own home, a son making provisions for his mother. From a cross, the atmosphere at Golgotha was not silent or reverent. Matthew 27:39-44 describes the scene with disturbing frankness. People passing by were hurling insults, shaking their heads. "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." The chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him among themselves. "He saved others, but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him." Even the insurgents crucified with him, at least initially before Luke's account of the second one's change of heart, were heaping insults on him. This was normal. Crucifixion was spectacle. Passers-by were expected to engage with it. The Romans designed it to be public humiliation. The crowd was behaving exactly as the Roman system intended. And then, at noon, everything changed. Mark 15:33. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. Matthew 27:45 says the same thing. Luke 23:44-45 adds a detail. The sun stopped shining. We've already established that non-biblical historians recorded this darkness. Let's go deeper into why it's impossible to explain as a natural eclipse. Passover occurs on the 14th of Nisan, which is by definition the full moon of the first spring month. A solar eclipse, in which the moon passes between the earth and the sun, is only possible during a new moon, when the moon is on the same side of the earth as the sun. A full moon solar eclipse is astronomically impossible. The moon is literally on the opposite side of the earth during Passover. So what was it? What possibilities that have been proposed? A severe Kamsin dust storm, the hot, dry wind that periodically sweeps in from the desert and can darken skies dramatically. A volcanic event. No known eruption at that time, but volcanic aerosols can affect light quality across large regions, some other atmospheric phenomenon. None of these fully accounts for the specific 3-hour duration and the scale of darkness that multiple independent sources describe. The honest scientific answer is, we don't know what caused it. The gospel writers didn't reach for an explanation either. They simply recorded it. That darkness is part of the psychological structure of this day. Something in the natural world, something in the sky, went wrong at precisely the moment of maximum suffering. Try to imagine it from inside the city. You're a Passover pilgrim. You've traveled for days to be here. You're in the temple courts, preparing your lamb for sacrifice. The morning has been clear and bright. It's Passover, the spring festival, and the day began beautifully. And at noon, the sky starts to darken, not like a cloud passing, darker, darker, until it is dark as night in the middle of the day. What do? You stop, you look up, you look at the people around you. No one has an explanation. No one has seen anything like this. You are in the holiest city in the world, in the middle of the holiest festival on the calendar, and the sun has gone out. There was no internet, no radio, no way to quickly learn whether this was happening everywhere or only here. No way to look up solar events Jerusalem 30 AD and find reassurance. You were in the dark, literally, and you had no framework for understanding it. In the first century Jewish worldview, darkness in the middle of the day was not ambiguous. The prophets had spoken directly to this. Amos 8:9-10, written 700 years earlier, says, "In that day, declares the sovereign Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your religious festivals into mourning and all your singing into weeping. I will make all of you wear sackcloth and shave your heads. I will make that time like mourning for an only son, and the end of it like a bitter day, mourning for an only son." The people in that city, the ones who knew their scriptures, would have known that verse, and they would have felt the cold hand of it. The darkness lasted 3 hours. We should sit in those 3 hours for a moment, rather than rushing past them. 3 hours of unnatural darkness in the middle of the day is not a brief atmospheric curiosity. It is a sustained psychological event. It is long enough that people who initially reassured themselves, "It's just a cloud, it will pass," would have stopped reassuring themselves. Long enough for panic to cycle through crowds and settle into something quieter and more dangerous than panic: dread. Children who had been brought to Jerusalem for their first Passover would have been terrified. Pilgrims who had traveled weeks to reach the holy city would have been asking whether they needed to find shelter, whether some catastrophe was approaching, whether this was the beginning of something they had no category for. The merchants and vendors, whose livelihoods depended on these festival crowds, would have watched their customers freeze in place, looking up, buying nothing. And the temple priests, who understood better than anyone the theological weight of what the sky was doing, would have kept working. The Passover sacrifices could not stop. The Torah did not contain a provision for suspending the Passover rites due to supernatural darkness, so they continued in the dark, slaughtering lambs in the dark, the blood running in the ritual channels in the dark, the altar fire burning, the only reliable light source in the temple courts. As the natural light of the sun refused to come, it would have been one of the most surreal scenes in the history of that ancient institution. What was happening on the cross during those 3 hours? The Gospels are, by design, sparse on the physical details, but they record 7 statements, the 7 last words of Jesus from the cross, as they're traditionally called, and the timing and sequence of them tells a story. The early statements, the prayer for his executioners, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing," Luke 23:34. The conversation with the insurgent, the provision for Mary. These appear to happen before the darkness. After the darkness begins, a different quality enters the text. Matthew 27:46 and Mark 15:34 record the same moment. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is a quotation of Psalm 22, verse 1. It has been parsed and analyzed theologically for 2 millennia. What we need to understand here is not just the theological weight of it, but the physical and emotional reality of it. This was a man in the 9th hour of dying, after a night of arrest and interrogation, after scourging, after a march through the city, after hours on a cross, crying out with whatever voice he had left, "Why have you forsaken me?" Some of the bystanders misunderstood. They thought he was calling for Elijah. Someone ran and got a sponge, soaked it in sour wine, the wine and water mixture Roman soldiers drank, vinegar wine called posca, and lifted it up to his lips on a stick. He received it. Then, John 19:30. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. The Greek word translated, "it is finished," is tetelestai. It is a single word in the original. In the ancient world, it was stamped on paid tax receipts. It meant debt discharged, account settled, obligation completed. Luke 23:46 adds the final word, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." He died. Now pay attention, because what happens in the next few minutes is the part of this story that most documentaries skip past. And they shouldn't, because the events that immediately followed the death of Jesus are, historically, the most difficult to rationalize and the most documented. Matthew 27:51-53. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. 4 distinct events, simultaneously, or near simultaneously. Let's take them one at a time. The temple curtain. Herod's temple had 2 major curtains. The outer curtain separated the court of the Gentiles from the inner sanctuary. The inner curtain, the parochet, separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber where, according to Jewish theology, the very presence of God dwelt on earth. The high priest entered this room only once a year, on Yom Kippur. This curtain was not decorative. According to Josephus, the parochet was 60 feet tall and 4 inches thick. Some traditions say it took 300 priests to move it. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record that this curtain was torn in 2 at the moment of Jesus' death. The tearing, they specify, was from top to bottom. meaning it couldn't have been done by human hands reaching up and pulling. Something tore it from above. The theological meaning is unmissable. The curtain that separated humanity from the presence of God, that required the mediation of priests, the sacrifice of animals, the strict observance of ritual law to even approach, was torn open, gone, destroyed. Whether you believe the theological interpretation or not, consider the historical reality. If this curtain was torn in the full Passover temple, with thousands of priests operating in the complex, it would have been witnessed by dozens or hundreds of people simultaneously. It was not a private event. This was the central ritual space of a nation at its most heavily trafficked moment of the year, and the most sacred internal barrier of that space was destroyed. The Talmud, compiled centuries later, preserves a remarkable tradition in Tractate Yoma 39b. During the last 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the lot for the Lord never came up in the right hand, nor did the crimson-colored strap become white, nor did the westernmost light shine, and the doors of the Hekal would open by themselves. 40 years before the temple's destruction in 70 AD puts this at approximately 30 AD. The rabbis who preserved this tradition saw it as a sign that God had withdrawn from the temple. The precise date matches the earthquake. Matthew 27:51 records, "The earth shook, the rocks split." An earthquake at the time of the Crucifixion. In 2012, a team of geologists, Amos Nur from Stanford and Dawn Burgess, published research in the International Geology Review examining geological evidence from the Dead Sea region. They identified a major seismic event that occurred in the 1st century, dated approximately between 26 and 36 AD. The sediment cores from the Dead Sea showed a disruption pattern consistent with a significant earthquake during this period. They noted that the timing is consistent with what the Gospel accounts describe. This is not a proof of the resurrection. It is a confirmation that a significant geological event occurred in the right place at roughly the right time. But it's the third event that is genuinely startling. The tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Matthew is the only gospel writer to record this. He gives no names, no specific stories, no elaboration. He simply states it and then moves on. This has generated centuries of commentary, skepticism, and theological debate. Was it literal, metaphorical, an interpolation, a symbolic intensification of the resurrection narrative? What's often missed in these debates is the rhetorical strategy Matthew is employing. He is writing for a Jewish audience in the mid to late 1st century. His readers include people who may have been in Jerusalem on that day. He does not hedge. He does not say, "Some people reported." He states it as historical fact and names the location, the holy city. He's writing to people who could have checked. This is not the behavior of a man fabricating mythology. This is the behavior of a man writing in a community where the event he's describing has living witnesses. You don't have to believe it, but you have to reckon with the fact that Matthew wrote it. The 4th event happens at Golgotha, not at the temple. The centurion, Matthew 27:54. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." Mark 15:39 has it as one man. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." A Roman officer, a professional soldier whose job was to execute criminals, a man who had likely supervised dozens or hundreds of executions and knew exactly what death looked like. He stands at the foot of the cross and says, in the language of Roman imperial religion, in which Son of God was a specific loaded, politically charged title claimed by Caesar himself, Surely this man was the Son of God. What did he see? Mark's version is precise. He says it was how he died and the manner of death that moved the centurion. Not just the earthquake, not just the darkness, the way Jesus died. People who died by crucifixion did not typically die the way the Gospels describe. Crucifixion victims spent their last hours or days in delirium, in desperate physical struggle, often screaming incoherently. They didn't have extended conversations. They didn't give away their mothers. They didn't make theological pronouncements. They didn't say, "It is finished," and then calmly give up their spirit, as though choosing the moment of death. The centurion had seen men die on crosses. He had never seen anyone die like this. And now he stood in the middle of an earthquake, in the middle of a supernatural 3-hour darkness that had just lifted. And he said the words that would eventually replace Divi Filius, son of the divine Julius, son of Caesar, as the central confession of the Roman Empire. 300 years later, the Emperor of Rome would be a Christian, but that's still 300 years away. We're not there yet. The immediate aftermath. It was Friday afternoon, Passover. The Sabbath began at sunset, and Jewish law prohibited leaving bodies on crosses during the Sabbath. Deuteronomy 21:22-23 commanded that the body of an executed man must be buried before nightfall. John 19:31-32 records that the Jewish leaders asked Pilate to have the crucified men's legs broken to speed their deaths before sunset. Pilate agreed. The soldiers broke the legs of the two insurgents. They came to Jesus. He was already dead. To confirm death, because men sometimes survived crucifixion and were found to be alive when taken down, a soldier drove a spear into his side. John 19:34. One of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. John emphasizes this detail. He says in verse 35, "The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you also may believe." An eyewitness insisting on a specific physical detail. The blood and water that flowed from the spear wound has been the subject of extensive medical analysis. Dr. Edwards's 1986 JAMA article proposed that the water may represent pericardial fluid or pleural effusion, fluid that accumulates around the heart and lungs under conditions of severe physical trauma. Its presence is consistent with a specific cause of death, hypovolemic shock compounded by respiratory failure and, possibly, cardiac rupture. In other words, the physical evidence preserved in the text suggests Jesus was unambiguously dead when the spear was thrust into his side. Not unconscious, not in a coma, dead. Joseph of Arimathea arrived. He is one of the most intriguing figures in the entire Passion narrative. All 4 Gospels mention him. Matthew 27:57 calls him a rich man and a disciple of Jesus. Mark 15:43 calls him a prominent member of the council, meaning the Sanhedrin, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God. Luke 23:50-51 adds that he had not consented to their decision and action. John 19:38 says he was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. So, a member of the very council that had condemned Jesus, a man of wealth and social status, a secret believer, he went to Pilate and asked for the body. This was an act of extraordinary courage. To publicly claim the body of a man executed for sedition against Rome was to associate yourself with that sedition. In a climate where Rome was watching for any hint of instability, where Pilate was already politically vulnerable, to walk into the praetorium and ask for the body of the man you just watched die as a criminal required significant personal courage. Pilate was surprised Jesus was already dead. Crucifixion typically took much longer, and summoned the centurion to confirm it. The centurion confirmed, yes, dead. The body was released. Nicodemus came too. John 19:39-40 records his arrival. He brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. 75 pounds of burial spices. This is not a small amount. This is a royal burial. Nicodemus, also a Pharisee, also a member of the Sanhedrin, the same man who had come to Jesus secretly at night in John chapter 3, spent a fortune on his burial and risked his career to participate in it. They wrapped the body in linen strips with the spices in the manner of Jewish burial customs and placed it in a new tomb in a garden near Golgotha. John 19:41. At the place where Jesus was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. A new tomb, never used, Joseph's own tomb. Matthew 27:60 specifies this. They rolled a large stone against the entrance. The sun was setting. The Passover Sabbath was beginning. Jerusalem settled into its required rest. But the city was not the same city it had been that morning. Something had happened to it. Something that the pilgrims who came for the festival and then returned to their home countries would carry with them. Something that the priests who had seen the temple curtain torn would not be able to explain. Something that the people who had felt the earthquake and watched the darkness come and go would not forget. 2 months later, at the Feast of Pentecost, Peter would stand in Jerusalem and preach to the crowds, and 3,000 people would respond in a single day. Acts 2:41. 3,000 people in the same city, less than 60 days later. Think about what that means. Jerusalem was not a sympathetic audience. This was the city where the crucifixion had just happened. The high priests were still in power. The Sanhedrin had not disbanded. The Romans were still occupying. The political and religious establishment that had handed Jesus to Pilate was still fully operational. And Peter, a Galilean fisherman speaking in public, in a city where associating with Jesus was politically dangerous, stood up and told that crowd that the man they had killed was the fulfillment of everything in their scriptures, and that God had raised him from the dead. And 3,000 people said yes. Those people weren't easily fooled. These were pilgrims who had come to Jerusalem for Pentecost, many of them diaspora Jews from across the empire. Acts 2:9-11 lists them: Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, Libya, Rome. Educated people, traveled people, people with sophisticated enough theology to have made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem in the first place. They had heard the story. Some of them had been there 8 weeks earlier. Some of them had stood in the temple courts when the curtain tore. Some of them had felt the earthquake. Some of them had been in the streets when the darkness came. And when Peter stood up and said that this was not an accident, not a defeat, not the end of a movement, but the beginning of one, 3,000 of them walked into the water. Some of them had been there on the Friday of the darkness. Some of them had seen what the centurion saw. Some of them had been in the temple courts when the curtain tore. And now they were listening to a fisherman from Galilee tell them that the man they had watched die, the man they had mocked, or stood and watched others mock, or turned away from because it was too much to look at, had walked out of his tomb 3 days later. That is a story for another documentary. What we've been doing today is something narrower and in some ways more unsettling. We've been looking at the day itself, the specific, datable, locatable, historically verifiable Friday, the darkness that pagan historians recorded, the earthquake that geologists found evidence of in Dead Sea sediment cores, the centurion who broke with the entire logic of his professional world and said the wrong thing out loud, the curtain that tore, the man who refused the analgesic so that he would feel everything, and who died calmly in a manner that made a Roman execution specialist stop and stare. History is full of days that changed everything. The historians who study those days will tell you that the cause and effect is usually clear. You can trace the lines forward from the assassination of Franz Ferdinand to the First World War. You can trace the arc from the Black Death through the Renaissance. You can see how one event makes the next possible. This day is different. No historian predicted it. No political analysis anticipated it. No military strategy accounts for what happened in the following centuries, when the empire that built the cross became the empire that worshipped the man on it. Consider the strangeness of that trajectory one more time, because it is genuinely strange, and we often fail to let it be strange. The Roman Empire was the most powerful military and administrative organization in the ancient world. Its state religion was emperor worship. Its political theology centered on the divinity of Caesar. Its most visible tool of social control was crucifixion, designed specifically to communicate that those who challenged Roman order would suffer the most degrading, most public, most painful death the state could devise. And within 3 centuries, the emperor who ruled that empire, Constantine, had placed the symbol of crucifixion, the cross, on the shields of his soldiers, had made the day of Jesus' resurrection a legal holiday, had convened a council of bishops at Nicaea to officially define the theology of the man who had been executed as a criminal by one of Constantine's predecessors. The cross, Rome's instrument of terror, had become the symbol of the empire's own state religion. Try to model that outcome using any conventional historical framework. It doesn't work. Movements built around executed leaders don't usually do this. They either disappear, or they survive as underground cults, or they get co-opted and diluted beyond recognition. The trajectory of Christianity through the Roman Empire follows none of these patterns. A small group of terrified disciples hiding in Jerusalem after their leader's execution became within 300 years the official religion of Rome. Not through conquest, not through political alliance, not through any of the normal mechanisms of cultural change. Through testimony, person by person, story by story. I was there, or I knew someone who was there, or I heard from someone who knew someone. All of it leading back to one Friday in Jerusalem, when the sky went dark. If you found this investigation compelling, and if you're the kind of person who wants to go deeper into the historical and theological evidence behind these events, there's another documentary waiting for you right now. The evidence we've covered today is only part of the picture. Follow it further. The next video will show you something you haven't considered yet. The story isn't finished. It never was.